Greetings, everyone. Thank you for being here. My name is Anastasia Stacy Mann, and I'm the director of SPIA in New Jersey at the School of Public and International Affairs here at Princeton. We are delighted to have you here today, and we're delighted to have this fantastic panel here to kick off what we know is going to be an interesting, important, really urgent series. The SPIA in New Jersey program is about 1.5 years old and was developed under the leadership and with the blessing and enthusiasm of Dean Amani Jamal, who is committed to New Jersey as possibly no other dean of the School of Public and International Affairs, possibly no other administrator at Princeton University ever has been. So we are really lucky to have her guidance and support. At SPIA in New Jersey, we recognize New Jersey as an ideal laboratory for connecting the theory and the practice of democracy, particularly multiracial democracy, and embracing the opportunities and challenges that come with that. We have some core pillars that our programming happens around: engagement, service, outreach beyond the gates of the university, convening power to support evidence-based policy locally, statewide, and nationally. And happily, we have all of those represented here today. Rigorous research development and sharing of information to inform equitable public policy. We really try to keep students centered in the work that we do, and academic offerings in partnership with research. We have students in the audience who are doing research with community-based and advocacy organizations. We have visiting faculty who are directing initiatives around clemency that's happening now. Just Joe Krakora, maybe raise your hand out there. There he is. Talk to Joe about that. And the convening power piece is part of what's happening here today. So we're very lucky to have 4 fellows who are policy fellows who are kind of a brain trust that helps direct the activities of SPIA in New Jersey. And they are Amal Sinha of the ACLU. This is this year's slate. Adriana Abizadeh of the Kensington Corridor Trust. Nedia Morsi of Make the Road New Jersey, and Brandon McCoy of the Fund for New Jersey. So Brandon is the man of the hour, I would say, and really this series is his brainchild. Brandon is an established leader in state policy analysis and advocacy in New Jersey. He is born and bred New Jerseyite. Graduated from the College of New Jersey with a master's degree from the Blaustein School of Planning and Policy at Rutgers. He was a program associate at the Fund for New Jersey, which is the entity that he's now directing, president of, so that's a lovely arc to see. And he has served at the national level at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. He's really a maven of all things tax and budget. So it's always really interesting to hear what Brandon has to say, and I'm so pleased that he's here to run this event today. I'm going to kick it to you, Brandon, but I just want to highlight the other events in this series which are happening. Do we have the other dates? November 12th and 20th. Okay, so, and we'll get that information out to you. But welcome, thank you for being here. Thank you to the co-sponsors, which are the Center on Public Policy and Finance, the program, the Department of African American Studies, the Program for Research on Inequality, the Public Lecture Series, and Labyrinth Books. Thanks so much for being here, and here's to you, Brandon.
Thank you very much. Can we applause for Stacy, please? Stacy has done so much to help SPIA New Jersey get started and to really ground it in some wonderful events. And so I'm very thankful to you and the work of your team to make the space available to us and the resources available to us. So it's great to be here with you all this afternoon, or this evening, I guess it's almost 5. Again, my name is Brandon McCoy. I'm currently the president of the Fund for New Jersey, but also a SPIA New Jersey fellow. And as Stacy said, I'm a Jersey boy through and through. And so really trying to think through, given what's happening next week, we have an election. Given what's happening next year, we have a gubernatorial election. New Jersey has led the country in a lot of ways when you think about the economic policy that's been passed, and I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge Labor Commissioner Angelo in the audience, who's done a lot to help implement that policy that we've done over the past couple of years. But a lot of that has been sort of hidden, I think, for national audiences. Some of the, I guess, benefit, and I would consider oftentimes negative of our location, is that we're between, 2 major media markets in New York and Philadelphia. If you're in North Jersey, you get a whole lot of New York news. If you're in South Jersey, you get Philly news. If you're in Central Jersey, which does exist because we're in it right now, probably more New York news. But you're not really getting a lot of news about Trenton these days, and that's a problem for us as New Jerseyans if we want to really think about what our state needs to be 10, 15, 20, 50 years from now, right? And so the thrust of this series is really to have conversations about what the New Jersey economy is, what it can and should be, and what that means in sort of the national context. The sort of ways that we think about the economy and economic policy has just shifted dramatically over the past 10, 15, 20 years, and will continue to shift. And so very, very thankful to be engaged with some major leaders, both at the national and local level. And so I'll introduce them quickly, and then we'll get started for the conversation. And so first, furthest away from me at the end, the last chair there is Adam Goldstein, who is an assistant professor who is jointly appointed in the Department of Sociology and the SPIA School here at Princeton. Thank you for being with us. Marlena Ubel is a policy analyst at New Jersey Policy Perspective, where she works on criminal justice policy. I hired Marlena at NJPP, so I'm very thankful for you for being here today. And then Felicia Wong is the president and CEO of the Roosevelt Institute, where she directs the organization's mission, vision, and strategy in pursuit of a high-care, low-carbon economy that works for all. And Felicia has a ream of experience and successes that would take me another 3 hours to roll off here. But probably when I think of my policy spirit animal, it is Felicia Wong. So thank you very, very much for taking the time to be here today. It's wonderful to be in conversation with all of you. I'll quickly say, just to get us started a little bit in general, pardon me for using notes. I do have a 2-month-old at home, so sleep is at a premium these days, but I'm going to use my notes to guide this conversation. It's just an honor and privilege to be with you all today as we kick off this conversation. Obviously, we have an election in a week, and it would just be weird to not at least acknowledge that as we're talking about issues that will be significantly guided by and informed by the outcome of that election. And so first, just thinking about the past 15 years of economic policy, during the Great Recession, as someone who graduated into the Great Recession from undergrad, the way that economics was thought of is very different than the way it's thought of today. Issues and ideas that are on the table right now would have been laughed out of the room 15 years ago. Things like a child tax credit, things that like high levels of investment into industrial policy. And so first, I would like to hear from you, Felicia, because I think you're just so skilled at sort of framing these things. When you think about the past 15 years of policy and how things have shifted, what has changed, but more importantly, I think, why has it changed?
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's so nice to be here. Thanks, Brandon, for that lovely introduction. I'm really excited to be on this panel, actually to learn more about how you all think about New Jersey policy priorities. I think it's really important for those of us who work at the national level to understand much more about what happens in state decision-making and city decision-making. So with that, I'm excited to be here to learn. And to answer Brandon's question, what has changed? How have so many new ideas come to the fore? There are a lot of places, I suppose, where you could start that story. I sometimes start it in 2008, which is where you started it, 2008, 2009, the Great Recession. I think one of the, well, two things about that period. One is that it is very clear that some of the deepest causes of the recession, of the financial market collapse, of the housing market collapse, were the financialized economy in the first place, right? The fact that so much of our economy was highly leveraged, and that so much of the quote-unquote real economy, manufacturing, and really important services were highly privatized, and so much of the rest of our economy had been basically financialized. So that's clearly the state of play in 2007, 2008 as we think about what was driving the economy. That also made our economy obviously very precarious. And so what happened after the Great Recession, of course, is that the policy response from Washington was extremely slow. It was slow, and it was smaller for political reasons than even the economists at the time said was going to be necessary. So what kind of policy relief, what kind of fiscal policy was going to be needed to make sure that people could stay in their homes after the housing market crashed, to make sure that they were not going to be thrown out onto the streets, and to make sure that actually workers were going to come first? Basically, the reaction from policymakers was ultimately, the Obama package was about $700 billion in relief. That was at least a third, if not 50%, too small. And some economists at the time knew it, but there was no way that you could have that much fiscal relief, that you could have that much government spending. That was just off the table as a mental model. So that then takes you to the question, well, it's not really, what is driving policy decisions? What's driving policy decisions is how you think the economy is structured and for whom. And so I always think about ideas when I think about how we think about what is the idea of who the economy works for, and what is the idea of balance of power in the economy. And so at that time, the idea was it was much more important to save the banks, it was much more important to save the credit markets than it was to make sure that people stayed in their homes and workers kept their jobs. And as a result, you saw a very, very, very slow recovery. You saw a jobless recovery or a very low wage recovery between 2009 and 2012. We did see jobs recover, but over half of the jobs that were created in that period were low wage. They were high poverty, low wage jobs. So, but that then set off a whole lot of alarm bells in the policy community. We knew we could do better. We knew we needed to do better. The combination of that very slow recovery, which of course kicked off the Occupy Wall Street movement in 2011, 2012, the Occupy protest, that basically started people thinking, wait a minute, what if you did have a stronger government hand in making sure that there was enough money in the economy to keep people in their homes? And why is it that you actually put the banks first? And was this the necessary thing to do? So there was a whole revolution, essentially, in economics and in policymaking between 2008 and 2016 that basically started people thinking that the sort of neoliberal, make sure that the markets come first and all good things will follow thereafter, that way of thinking really started to shift. I think it started to shift in economics departments across the country. I think it started to shift in what people actually expected from their policymakers. So it was a combination of this very slow, less than adequate response, the very poor outcomes from that response, and then the movement and the public outrage at so much at basically the jobless recovery. That started to kick off an entirely new way of thinking about how to structure the economy. Now, I'm not going to tell the entire story because you can ask me. If you want me to, I will. But I would just say that what was important in that period was shifting how we thought about the economy. And by the time of 2016 and Donald Trump's election. It's hard to say that 6 days in advance of this next election. But when Donald Trump came into the White House, he then kicked over every remaining norm for policymaking. And so the combination of a whole bunch of people who did not share Donald Trump's politics and did not share Donald Trump's ideology, but a whole bunch of people who were getting together thinking about what a post-neoliberal politics and post-neoliberal economy was going to look like, with Donald Trump kicking over, again, every norm, those two things, I think, paved the way for then the kind of election we saw in 2019 and 2020, where Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders and Kamala Harris and Pete Buttigieg and all the rest, you saw an election there where there was a race to actually articulate a much stronger, much more pro-worker, high taxes on corporations. Let's look at how powerful the corporations really are. It was a whole new policy conversation in 2019 and 2020, and that's because of all of the work that had been done for the 10 years previous. There's obviously more to the story, but I think it was a real shift in ideas born out from economics itself and by people in the streets saying, we're not going to take this anymore.
Yeah. And just thinking back to the experience in New Jersey, we had one of the slowest recoveries because you have
nationwide.
Yeah, and of any state in the country, because it was the federal response that was inadequate combined with the state response that focused on tax cuts for the wealthy,
right.
And did not invest in NJ Transit, did not invest in higher education, did not invest in things that would ensure people were able to get jobs, recover employment more quickly. And so we had I would say a 6 to 7 year recovery that was just very slow and painful.
Well, I'll also say this. One of the things that people recognize right away as a shortcoming of the 2008-2009 recovery plan, so little money went to state and cities, right? You didn't have money going directly to workers. You also did not have money going directly to states and cities. And so fast forward to the post-COVID rescue response, both the CARES Act, to give some credit to policymakers in 2020, and then certainly the American Rescue Plan in 2021, you had a wholesale rethinking, not only of the size of the package, there were multiple trillions of dollars between CARES and American Rescue Plan that went out from the federal government. So multiple trillions rather than 700 billion. You had about, between CARES and ARP, you had close to 3 trillion. But you also had a difference in how all of this was structured. You had money going directly to small businesses, you had money going directly to workers, you had increased unemployment, and very importantly, you had money directly to states and cities, which, in addition to money to renters, all of this is not only a different amount of money, but a different structuring of who the money was intended to serve.
Yep, absolutely. So I guess for Adam, you've done a lot of research on sort of economic cycles and markets and sort of the boom-bust nature of things in the neoliberal era. When you look at the last 10 to 15 years, what are some of the biggest lessons that you would say people should take away?
Thanks. Well, I think Felicia synthesized it all quite beautifully. I will also begin with a little bit of a disclaimer about my own research profile. It probably reflects what Stacy was mentioning as sort of a historic insufficient attention to New Jersey politics. So I'm also excited to be here and starting the process of linking some of these sort of macro trends with New Jersey's specific needs, position, and opportunities within this broader policy landscape. I think Felicia's absolutely right that I think a lot of what we've seen over the last 10 to 15 years can be sort of periodized nicely in terms of responses to 2008 and some of the failures of those responses. I remember in 2008, a good friend of mine wrote what turned out to be a very prescient op-ed. I doubt very many people read it at the time, suggesting that the inability, the sort of inattention among the Obama administration policymakers to the scale of the problem they faced was going to result in an era of very ugly reactionary politics, and I think that's come to fruition. But one of the sort of unexpected aspects of that, and I think Felicia alluded to this, is a turn away from what we might sort of characterize as neoliberalism. We can talk about the semantics of that term if people want to get into it, but that has been largely coming from progressives, but has actually converged with some policy currents on the right. And it's particularly evident in certain areas more than others, like trade policy. And I think that that's something we should continue to think about, because I think it's going to, regardless of who wins this election, that might be a future current that we're going to be thinking about nationally, but also in terms of how New Jersey positions itself. I guess the other thing I'd say, and maybe this is, maybe the other side of the story, I think Felicia's absolutely right about ideas, and that's ideas about the economy, particularly expert, technocratic elite, their ideas about the economy and how it works, and how that filters into actual policy making. But I think we also have to sort of reckon with the legacies of past policies, right? This is sort of a truism in social science, right? That, past policies create these lasting legacies. So even when ideas change, we're still sort of operating within those structures. And so, at these, I sometimes attend these kinds of events, and there's a lot of, debate and discussion about, is neoliberalism over? And I think certainly in the realm of sort of the policy debate, probably yes. But if we look at sort of some of the fields policy domains that I've spent a lot of time thinking about, healthcare, higher education, I think the ideas and the conversation have shifted, but I think that the structures in which we're operating and in which we're imagining possibilities for change are necessarily building on foundations that have been created in through prior paradigms. And I think, that's something we don't want to lose sight of when we sort of start talking about, a whole new era of thinking. It is probably a new era of thinking about and imagining policy, but it's one that's necessarily constrained by sort of what we have. So you can see this in the realm of healthcare policy, right? It's pretty hard at this point. People have proposed a lot of interesting ideas about single payer, et cetera, but the structure of the Affordable Care Act, is very much one that reflects this sort of prior paradigm of market-centered provision. So I think that's just a general issue that I would raise in sort of thinking about what's changed, what remains sort of persistent in some ways.
No, very, very prescient, and actually raises an alarm bell for me, because I think about New Jersey, we have, the institutions that we rely upon, obviously during the pandemic and, later years, relying upon things like Department of Health, Department of Labor, Department of Community Affairs, in particular, to guide us through those challenging moments. These are departments that saw, for the past 10 years, a reduction in staff and capacity and a reduction in resources. And so a little different than the point you're making about, the foundations, but I'm thinking about institutions at large, and also then just who is in those institutions to guide us, both in thinking about the future and addressing, the current moments. And I feel like there's been a bit of a reduction in thinking about the importance of investing in institutions, even just sort of in policy world. You see a lot of people doing consulting and things like that, and not working in, organizations broadly. But institutions are the things where we sort of organize ourselves. And there's been a lack of support for those in a way that's a little bit concerning about, what does the administrative state look like and its ability to actually meet the needs that people have, right? And so speaking of like needs that people have on like a very ground floor level, Marlena, you've done a lot of tremendous research and advocacy in New Jersey, unlocking a lot of really important policies in criminal justice area. There's a quote by Baldwin that I like to think about a lot. I mean, Baldwin's like the person that I read the most, throughout my career, and he says, if one really wishes to know how justice is administered in the country, one does not question the policemen or the lawyers or the judges or the protected members of the middle class. One goes to the unprotected, those precisely who need the law's protection the most, and listens to their testimony. So I expand that to everything. I expand it to economics in particular as well. And so just given your connectedness to and work in support of those who, sort of rely on some of these policies and rely on their implementation to be going well. How do you think about these sort of broader ideas? What have you seen over the past few years when you think about their impact in New Jersey?
Yes, so before I answer your question directly, I'm going to say that I'm going to be answering this in the context of the criminal legal system in New Jersey, because that is where my expertise lies. But to get to that quote, I think it's important, even within the context of the criminal legal system in New Jersey, because the folks whose lives are shaped directly or indirectly by this system are the most vulnerable among us. And we should all be concerned about the criminal codes, because these are not just a measure by which we can tell if our society is equitable or just. It's also something that impacts us all, because policy is deeply intertwined. The criminal codes impact health, housing, economic policy, labor, and immigration. So when I talk about the criminal legal system in New Jersey, know that it ripples outward. And then to get back to your question, when I think about the last 10 years of policy change, the last decade or so, it's really a mixed bag. So a decade or so, we sort of, in New Jersey and nationally, we kind of have this reckoning around mass incarceration and the drug war and all of disenfranchisement and all of the harm that caused. And we really started to do some work in the policy realm to repair that harm. We made some significant efforts towards decarceration, where we're shrinking our prison population. We legalized cannabis, here more recently, but in other places earlier. And we started to really, it was good. We were doing some good work. And then the pandemic happened, and the murder of George Floyd. So we see this violence. We're forced to reckon with this state violence against communities of color, but Black folks specifically. And at the same time, we see more serious illness and death, higher rates in communities of color because of the pandemic. And there's this push, there's this really, really strong push for divestment from carceral systems and investment in communities and community well-being. And we were like on the verge of this transformative moment. We could almost see the interconnectedness of all of it. And advocates dared to think, are we gonna raise the carceral state to the ground? Is it happening? But that didn't happen, right? That's not what happened. And in fact, in the last few years, we have seen a backslide. We've been backsliding in this state. We have seen an increase in rhetoric that criminalizes young people. We have seen more proposals for harsher penalties for nonviolent crime. We have seen things that are reminiscent of the 90s era's tough on crime stuff that got us where we were to begin with. And unlike the positive reforms I mentioned before, these policies feel reactionary, purely reactionary, because they're not evidence-based, like these other positive reforms, like bail reform was evidence-based. And so I guess what I'm saying is, what works are policies like bail reform, are policies that center the most vulnerable among us and choose to benefit those folks, because those are the policies that help and improve all of our systems and that help us all. And what we need to see more of are policy makers that are willing to defend those policies and stand on business and say, no, this works, and not go backwards because of vibes.
I mean, definitely with vibes. Yeah. Didn't yesterday or today the governor signed a law increasing penalties on home invasion, even though home invasions are down?
Yes, correct. Yeah, they're very down. Mm-hmm. And there is within that law a provision that would allow minors to be tried as adults despite whether or not they physically harm anyone.
So I know you're...
Sorry.
No,
can I ask a question? So like why do you think you're seeing the backlash there? Because I think progress always brings backlash, and I think in sort of national economic trends, we're about to see that too, or we already are seeing that. But I'm just very curious, what is the driver? What is driving the backlash?
I think people write papers about this kind of thing, right? Like you can think about, I can speculate about what the backlash is. It could be it feels reactionary to the pandemic, to the big movement, the movement that was led by the movement for Black Lives, we felt like we were really making some progress, so it was a backlash to that. It could be elections. Crime is always up during elections.
I mean, there is, I think I was listening to an Ezra Klein podcast, but they were talking about how crime is always sort of, there's a hysteria of crime,
Yeah.
regardless of what the statistics, these stats on crime are.
Yeah.
Crime could be low, crime could be high, but regardless of what the reality is, there's just a hysteria on crime. And even in this area, and you live in New York, right, there's just been this sort of rhetoric of like, oh, crime's out of control in the city, right? And so I think just in general, I tend to think a lot about our media diet and our media we have a very decentralized media system now, and it's very difficult to think about ways in which folks are receiving similar information, and we all, whatever you're doing with regards to interacting and receiving information via Instagram or TikTok or Snapchat or whatever it is, Twitter, I will not say X, Twitter, and whatever else is on YouTube, you are one of one. Right, that is your media diet, and I shudder to think about the impact that's going to have on us long term. But and a lot of those algorithms, reward reactionary content and reactionary engagement as well. And so, we'll get to some of the broader concerns that brings me a little bit down the line. But Marlene, I think you're very right about all of this, and then New Jersey kind of naturally enjoys a profile as being a little bit more liberal and progressive, especially socially, but we're also one of the most segregated states in the country. Yeah. And so, when we think about how much these policies or sort of the benefits of these policies have spread, they tend to not reach parts of our state that they need to reach the most. And so, what do you make of that segregation? What do you make of ways to sort of break down the things that are preventing us from bringing prosperity to some of the most impoverished parts of the state?
Yeah, so New Jersey, which I love New Jersey, but New Jersey has the highest Black-white disparity in incarceration in the country. New Jersey also has one of the highest Black-white disparities in foster care. These things are not a coincidence. New Jersey used to be called the slave state of the North. That might surprise some people in this room. These things are a result of our history and the power that is entrenched throughout time because of that history. And I could answer your question, Brandon, by just saying the county line, right? This is an illustration of that power and that entrenched power. Policymakers tend to answer to party bosses, not the electorate. And also, the fact that we are largely a blue state with closed primaries doesn't make the problem any better. It creates this kind of mini electorate that the policymakers are actually more responsive to. And also off-year elections. People that vote, the voting that goes on in off-year elections is smaller, whiter, wealthier. So the electorate that the policymakers are really concerned with, they are not thinking about these progressive policies that we're talking about because they don't recognize or care about the needs in these communities. And then the second piece of this is that there's not a lot of follow-through sometimes. We get these great policy wins, and then they're not implemented well, or they're not implemented at all. Maybe they're not given the resources to be implemented properly. So you have folks that are struggling so much to get what they need, whether it's because the resources are not there because the electorate doesn't care to ask the policymakers to make it available, or because it's in some fund somewhere that they have to apply for, but they don't know how or that it exists.
So this brings me to a question that I'd like for you all to touch on a little bit, and something, Felicia, I've heard you talk a lot about at Roosevelt, which is the intersection and the sort of the self-reinforcement of economic rights and civil rights, right? And like, what good is your right to vote if you are hungry and impoverished and just, you're living a life of precarity? How can you actually be a full citizen and engage in this democracy in a robust way? And so, I guess when we think about New Jersey, but the country at large, there's been a big attack on voting rights. but also it sort of it seems to be a little bit combined with a desire to also introduce more precarity into people's lives, taking away rights to self-determination and abortion, taking away or rather attacking immigrant communities and trying to make it so that they are fearful to engage in public life. How do you sort of have this framework and think about the importance of advancing not just economic rights but also civil rights overall, just everybody?
As you say that, it made me think about a Franklin Roosevelt quote. I am, of course, duty-bound to quote FDR at some point in any set of public remarks I give. But, Roosevelt said, and forgive the gendered language, this was, almost 100 years ago, but necessitous men are not free. Necessitous people are not free. So if we think about freedom, if we think about political freedom, it is not possible to be truly free if you are hungry, if you do not have a clean and safe and stable place to live, if you do not have, access to health care, to education. So I think about the intersection of economic security and political freedom as I think of them as very, very, very close. So I also then think about the fact that so many of our racial disparities, economic disparities, whether it's the racial wealth gap, the racial income gap, occupational segregation, the segregation of foster care or incarceration that you talked about. You can talk about any of the racial gaps that we are talking about right now, and I think what we need to realize is that they are absolutely and positively a result of policy choices, many of which were made a very long time ago, many of which were made actually under FDR. When you look at the disparities for whom did the GI Bill serve in the 1940s? The GI Bill served mostly young men coming home from the war who were white, who could take advantage of jobs and mortgages to actually begin to build wealth, have enough in the bank to buy a home, have enough in the bank to pass down to their children, make sure that they could get a college education at a decent tuition rate, make sure that their children could. All of these, you could look at redlining, and these are all policy choices. And while most of these nominal, the disparities by name are no longer black, white, Asian, Latino, but we still live with the effects because racialized wealth, you do not get rid of that without affirmative attempts to reverse generations of racialized wealth, and you can't get rid of that without affirmative and structural, not individual, but structural policy responses. And I raised all of that because when you think about people's economic rights, the rights to obviously income, all of the things that FDR said were important in his second economic Bill of Rights, these are political rights in two ways. They're political in that the lack thereof is the result of political and policy choices, and the lack thereof prevents people from actually exercising their full political agency. So these are racialized rules that some of which still exist, many of which do not exist, but certainly the penumbra of those rules continues to keep us in an extraordinarily unequal society. And part of what I think it means to go beyond neoliberalism, which basically said, right, the free market is going to take care of most problems, and the few problems that it doesn't, the government will clean up on the back end. But for the most part, a free market system works. Well, that is actually not accurate if the free market system is structured by all of the racialized rules that I just sort of ticked through. The free market system is not going to actually provide in ways that are fair, equitable, and lead to shared prosperity and shared growth. It's just not unless you affirmatively correct for the mistakes and the sins, frankly, of the past.
If anybody wants to add to any of that.
Sure. I think that's all right. Just tying this back to New Jersey, this is a state that's about to, or really is in the midst of an experiment in the expansion of voting rights. We're actually, another case of New Jersey being against the grain a little bit. And maybe it just reflects just how backwards the voting system was in this state until very recently for the ballot structure. But I think it will be an interesting site to sort of look and see, okay, does the greater degree of political representation afforded by this change, how does it change, the way that economic demands from various groups, constituencies, demographic populations, racial groups, are represented in the policies that result. And I don't think it's purely sort of a passive question. I think that it creates opportunities and mobilization opportunities for various groups that, I'm not on the cutting edge of it all, but I, that's something where there is a lot of possibility that's been opened up by, what seems like a kind of arcane shift. So that's one thing. Another thing we didn't raise in the sort of initial framing discussion about trends in the last decade or so is that there's actually been a real resurgence of labor union organizing and power, particularly among the private sector parts of the labor movement, which had been largely written off for dead. And to the extent that unions are about securing not just benefits, but economic rights, and there's there's a sizable literature in political science about the spillover effects of that for things like electoral politics. That's another opportunity, I think, to build on, at least for those who are interested in progressive change and how the intersection of sort of economic rights and political rights can be self-reinforcing in ways, and we can maybe reverse some of these downward spirals.
Can I just add one thing to that? I think that's so important. I'm glad we have the labor commissioner in the room. The resurgence of both public support for labor and labor organizing. I know union density is not yet higher than it was 10 years ago, but the efforts to unionize, the support for unionizing has absolutely changed over the last 5 years, but that is not an accident. That is also the result of policy. There were two things in particular that made all of this, at least two, you all will say, but there are at least two things that made this possible. The first is the fact that the post-COVID recovery was so robust, so worker-forward. There was enough money in the system to make sure that people could stay in their jobs. They could actually leave their jobs if it was a bad job to start with, and they could seek a better job. They could start businesses if they wanted to. All of this this is the result of this is what a full employment economy looks like, right? The unemployment rate has been at or under 4% for over 40 months, 45 months probably at this point. Sorry, that's not true. That's not true about the unemployment rate for that long, but the increase in jobs, that's a 40+ month streak. At any rate, we've now seen a 4% unemployment rate for close to a year. My point being that the fact that the labor market is so good for workers, I don't think we should call it a tight labor market, by the way. I think we should call it a workers' market. It's better, I think. Just tight labor market sounds bad. Workers' market, that sounds better for workers. Anyway, this means that people can organize. This gives workers power to be able to organize, because you can walk away if it's bad. And if this is very, very, very important as a precondition for labor organizing. And then, of course, the second thing that's so important for labor organizing is the fact that the Biden-Harris administration made sure that the National Labor Relations Board was staffed by people who made sure that workers actually had the legal right to organize, and that employers couldn't discriminate against those who are organizing. So this is a result of policy. This is super important and not an accident.
It's almost like personnel is policy.
It's almost like personnel's policy.
It matters who's in the department. It matters who's in the seat. Absolutely. Real quick, I guess, so at the Fund for New Jersey, which I'm helming these days, we act in service of trying to improve the quality of public policy decision-making in the state and in the region. And something that is a bugaboo that anybody who knows me knows I rant about this all the time, but when we think about any of the policies that we want to see, you're inherently having a budget conversation. What is the capacity of the states to deliver on these priorities? And oftentimes our budget conversations are what I would consider to be backwards. They start with how much do we have, and then how do we want to spend it? I would consider a better conversation to be what do we want and what do we need, and then what is the sort of tax and economic policy that will deliver the resources to enable us to do those things. And so even thinking about the industrial policy that Roosevelt has led on and others have really sort of tried to build a sort of bigger vision of what a possible post-neoliberal future could look like, that is still kind of married to and matched with what I would consider to be a very stale tax policy vision. A lot of the tax policies that we see are very much so steeped in 1980s frameworks and rhetoric. And so maybe a difficult question to answer, but what would be a more modern tax policy design and approach that could match and bolster some of these industrial policy priorities that are really burgeoning and growing these days? Anybody?
I would take, but Adam, do you want to go?
Wealth taxes.
Do you want to elaborate on what you mean by wealth taxes? I agree with you. Look, the United States is a famously low tax nation. We raise, as a percentage of GDP, far less than almost any other member nation in the OECD. We currently raise about 16% of our gross domestic product as revenue for the federal government. Before 1980, that was closer to 20 or 21%. So just rough. And this is money that we could definitely raise. The wealthy, as Adam was suggesting, are getting wealthier. The corporate rate could be higher. Certainly the individual income tax rate could be higher. You could have higher carried interest. Like, many of this is actually part of what the Biden-Harris administration put forward in its recent budgets. But my point is that if we raised our total tax revenues from our current 16% to 20 or 21%, that is, roughly speaking, an extra $10 trillion over 10 years, which is enough money to pay for the entirety of the child care, elder care, paid leave, paid sick program. That alone would pay for the entirety of the care agenda that many advocates have been asking for. Now, let's be real, in our politics, we're not going to be able to go from 16 to 21% overnight. The Biden budgets suggested that we get to about half of that, and even that feels like a lot. And again, this is Brandon's specialty far more than it is mine. But the point is, there is so much more money that is possible. And not only that, I would say that if we actually essentially taxed the wealthy and taxed corporations that are making record profits right now and use that money to invest in education, childcare, decarbonizing the economy, we can't have everything we want, even if we raised all of those revenues, but we could have much more, and this would be good for the economy. The money that is currently sitting at the top is not being used particularly productively, especially if you compared it to what that would mean if we invested more in public higher ed, more in public child care, more in Medicare. I actually love Harris's, sorry, this is a 501c3 conversation, but I think on a policy level, the Medicare at Home vision, which would use Medicare to actually pay for home services for those who are elderly or for those who are ill, that's a game changer. We can afford a lot of this, and it would be smart investments in our economic future. So yeah, we should have a better tax code. Not to mention how it's designed, but I'm just talking about the revenue itself.
I actually, so I teach a course at Rutgers on the racial wealth gap, and yesterday we actually viewed a video by a professor here at Princeton, Laura Deronacourt, and so she was discussing the racial wealth gap. It was, I think, a video by the Center for New Economic Thinking, and the figure that her and her colleagues came up with in their paper to close the racial wealth gap was $10 trillion. So you just said $10 trillion.
Look what you could do with $10 trillion.
Right. So you could do a lot. You could do big things for sure. To speak a little bit to some maybe anxieties about the impact of policy or lack thereof these days, you just said, hey, these last 4 years I've seen some of the most robust, pro-worker, pro-labor policy impacts since FDR. It doesn't always feel like that is being felt in the country or at kitchen tables, right? And so how, we're all policy wonks here, like, how do you think about the fact that, and on one hand, the things that are being passed and implemented are having effect, but people are not seeing them and are not feeling them in the way that one would probably expect or hope. And so the way that I sometimes hear this phrase is that we are post-policy, which gives me all the heart anxiety in the world, because if we're post-policy, then it really is just a vibes economy, and we just do whatever feels right, based, regardless of evidence. But am I just being, overly anxious, or do you actually have concerns about sort of a possible post-policy dynamic? Anybody?
I'll start, but you all should chime in too. I don't think it's all that novel. Like when we talk about crime, right? Crime is always up at election time. It doesn't matter if crime is down, because it has been down many years over. It's always up, right? And people always feel that way. What worries me more is this messaging problem, I feel like. And I know we talk about this a lot, but people on the left, policymakers that care about progressive policy, it really feels like they've ceded the rhetorical space. There's no equivalent to Fox News, right? That just doesn't exist. And it feels like it's pulled everything a little bit to the right. And I think that policy always matters. Of course it matters. And it's our jobs to remind people of what's actually going on and to come from this evidence-based place, because that gives us the power, the foundation from which to fight back. And when things go wrong, when the cuts happen, policy really matters then.
Yeah, I would agree wholeheartedly. I think that the linkage between policy and electoral politics is always complicated. The political scientist Suzanne Mettler has this great turn, a phrase. Well, it's actually a whole book, in addition to a motto, called the submerged state. And this is about the difficulty of linking real policies that deliver to people real benefits to their perceptions of what they can see. This is really a problem of cause and effect. Policy is complicated. I think there's a lot of ways we could actually think about simplifying it. That's not usually at the top of the progressive agenda, but I think it could be in ways that allow us to make evident the linkage between policy proposals and real benefits. Now, people are not entirely inattentive to this. You see efforts at this. The Biden administration has made some efforts, and you typically see this with infrastructure projects, right? It's bipartisan, Inflation Reduction Act money at work. But I think it needs to go far beyond that. if we're going to really be able to create a message that resonates. It's not just messaging, it's making sure that message resonates, and doing so involves really thinking about the perceptual chains of cause and effect when it comes to delivering benefits. And you see this with a lot of policies. I mean, the Affordable Care Act, I brought it up earlier, was a classic case, right? Polls showed that Obamacare was really unpopular, but every single provision within the bill, with maybe one or two exceptions, was highly popular, right? But I mean, there's things like that. We have to, legislatively, there's often an imperative to package a lot of things together, but that has a downside. It can obscure some of the specificity that individuals value. So this is, again, for the New Jersey policy agenda, thinking through ways to make these popular things electorally pay off is a very important imperative for creating lasting progressive change that can't be so easily rolled back the next time there's a changing of the winds, right?
I totally agree about the impossibility, at least that's how it feels sometimes, of trying to speak clearly to, policymakers or voters, everyday people, just people, in a very broken media environment. So I want to get back to that. But I also want to say that like all of the policy changes we've seen in the last 4 years are actually really hard to talk about, and I think we should be honest about that. So much of the investment, this high care, low carbon, pro-worker economy that I hope we are moving toward. And I think that much of the legislation, right, the Inflation Reduction Act, which was the decarbonization, basically the decarbonization bill, and the Chips and Science Act, which was trying to reshore semiconductor manufacturing and other kinds of manufacturing, and in addition to the infrastructure bill, again, investing in roads, bridges, broadband, airports. All of that is not money in your pocket right tomorrow. That is not the same thing as the child tax credit, which, by the way, we passed and then took away. Like, most of the really, really, really big legislation is a multi-decade long investment. And most of the money's now been allocated, but most people aren't feeling the money. The job creation that is projected, most of that is happening right now in construction jobs, not in like the long-term manufacturing jobs or the teaching and nursing, et cetera, jobs that would then, be the next concentric circle out from the manufacturing jobs or the stronger service jobs. So this is just it's really hard to talk about, believe me, in 10 years, you're going to see the benefits. That's just a really hard, I wouldn't want to have to run for office with that as my message, as amazing as it was that this legislation passed with this kind of in this political environment. So that's thing one. Thing two, and I think it is a mistake to step away from this, is that the fact that inflation spiked significantly in 2022 and 2023 just made talking about any of the rest of this extraordinarily difficult. When people say they don't like the economy, what they really say is they don't like high prices. They're not saying they are against investments in broadband. They're definitely for investments in broadband, but they don't like high prices. And even as we've seen the inflation rate come down much closer to the 2% that the Fed would like to see, prices are still high relative to what they were 5 years ago, and people really remember that. There is an enormous debate about how much of this was caused by federal spending. The highly technical answer is some. But obviously, there was a very significant amount, probably about 2/3, that was caused by COVID supply chains themselves, the war in Ukraine, other things that really constrained supply, not things that constrained demand. But that's a really hard message also to run on. we cause more good than harm, but the good is going to be in 10 years, and the harm, anyway, like, this is very difficult. It is also very real. I absolutely think it was the right trade-off to make. Like, we at Roosevelt were some of the people to say in the very beginning that, it is far better in this time of uncertainty in March 2020, when COVID hit the American shores. It is far better to do too much than to risk doing too little, which you then heard President Biden repeating. I still believe that is true. The Economist magazine just said that the American economy is the envy of the world. Our inflation was more or less consistent with or even lower than most of the rest of the world's, and our recovery was certainly faster, so it was the right bet, but it sure doesn't feel like it if you're trying to run for office. So I think that is the second thing to say, that is just like, is complicated, and inflation to me feels like an inferno. There is nothing else that you can talk about if you're trying to talk about the economy if prices are rising. Triggers anxiety, and even if the cost of eggs are really a small part of any family's monthly budget, seeing the price of eggs rise really reminds you that you definitely can't afford to send your kid to college, and you definitely can't afford your rent. And those are big costs. So anyway, and those are long-term costs. So that's the second thing. And then the third thing on the broken media, sorry, I'm going on. But the third thing on the broken media environment, it is so true. And it is Fox News, but it's far more than Fox News. You talked about where people get their media from at this point. So close to 60% of Americans get all their news on their digital devices right now, which means it's tiny, it's snippets, it's a headline if you're lucky. Only 9% of Americans get their news in print anymore. About 20% get it on whatever television is these days. This is just a very broken media environment to try to communicate with anybody about anything, and it's therefore not a surprise that only 30% of Americans, maybe it's 35%, say they trust the media anymore. How in the world is a message that's already kind of complicated because we made investments that are going to be really great in 10 years. How in the world can you explain anything in such a fragmented media environment? So the challenge is very steep. And so it's literally breaks my heart, but also is not that surprising that Americans do not feel the result of all of the amazing work that has happened over the last 3 years and 11 months, 3 years and 9 months.
Thank you. I appreciate all that. So we're going to do Q&A. We'll do 3 or 4 questions at the end, and so I'm just going to ask one more question, but if you have a question, get it ready, and then we'll answer it up here. But so I'm going to take you at your word that policy still matters, and I'll show up to work on Monday. I think also then that, thinking about New Jersey specifically, we are a state that has a lot of different challenges, but we also have so many advantages, and sometimes those things are not fully appreciated or celebrated. We exist in the most active and sort of robust economic market in the world between Philadelphia and New York. We have easy access to international markets. We have diverse geography with a gorgeous shore and rolling farmland. We have walkable and quaint downtowns all over the state. We've got bustling urban cores. There's just a lot of stuff going on here. And even though sometimes we have some frustrations with the implementation of our policy wins, at least we have some very important policies that are on the books, right? And so for a state that has all of those things going forward, as we look forward to these next 4, 8, and even 20 years, how can a state with these benefits and assets really be leading the conversation across the country? We got to figure out our media market situation for sure. John Mooney's in the audience. NJ Spotlight's a big part of figuring out how to improve, the information that people receive in this state. But putting that to the side for a second, how should folks be working to take advantage of these these advantages going forward for the next 4 to 8 years? Do you think?
I think that we need to be really unapologetic about inequality. And I think that we need to really not be afraid to go after the ultra wealthy. I think sometimes policymakers shy away from this. But I think we need to really have an unwavering commitment to our values. I think there's something important in that argument to just stay true and be unapologetic about it. I mean, they are, right? Yeah, that's simple. That's what I'll try to keep it simple.
I think the answer to that probably depends a lot on next week. At least the how of that, if not the what. Yeah, well, if we think about some of New Jersey's infrastructure challenges and the sort of funding for these things, right? We can imagine all the challenges that might arise and all the opportunities that might arise. But either way, there's going to be a need to make good on it and actually implement in practice. I think when it comes to inequality in New Jersey, it's hard because of the geographic structure and the political geography of the state. And I think that this is maybe one of these things that can seem impossible, right? Segregation in New Jersey, there's a lot of reasons for it, but part of it is the way that our school districts are set up, right? That's not an easy thing to change. It's not a politically palatable thing to change, right? Progressives in Princeton would go berserk if that were really seriously on the table. Like, let's be honest. And so I think there's some like really big challenges like that are going to take a lot of creative thinking. But there are ways to mitigate some of the harms that come with this, right? Housing policies, transit policies, education policies can shift the equilibrium on this, even if it's not a wholesale restructuring of the entire political geography of New Jersey and the sort of spatial distribution of wealth.
I'm going to alter the question for you a little bit because you work at a national, federal level, but you do think a lot about sort of, I guess, the life cycles of policy and what is the impact of state policy on federal policy and vice versa. So for New Jersey, but for any state, at large, what are you hoping to see from state policy to sort of influence and sort of trickle up to the national level?
I'm not saying this just because it's you, Brandon. I think we absolutely must be holding the line on great tax policy out of states, right? It is just critical as we enter a season where, regardless of who wins this next election, 2025 will see an enormous tax fight in Washington. The many provisions of the Trump tax cuts will roll off. That gives people an enormous opportunity to actually raise enough revenue to raise rates where rates can and should be raised on the wealthy, on corporations, on capital. Again, in ways that would benefit the overall economy. So that is a huge opportunity, but we absolutely need to see states both advocate for that, hold the line, and demonstrate demonstrate what great tax policy could look like. That's one thing. And then the other thing, I am super interested in where housing policy is going to go in this country. I think you're totally right, Adam, that it is connected to, that housing policy is absolutely connected to education policy and educational opportunities. But we are in a we're on the cusp of a housing policy moment. Obviously, there are some things that can be done on a federal level with respect to thinking about the financing of housing and also incentives for actually building more housing faster. But in order for that to happen, you really do need to see building faster and building more equitably and building for all the people who need housing and not just the very wealthy who can afford very large homes. You need to see all of that incentivized at the state level as well. So I don't really know what a good state-federal partnership looks like on that. I've heard talk of a kind of race to the top set of incentives that would ask states to come forward with their best policies for building equitably and quickly. I think that would be really interesting, and it would be great if New Jersey were one of the states to actually demonstrate that that is possible. There's, plenty of rolling farmland to. There's plenty of opportunity. I'm not saying to build on the farmland, although maybe that. I mean, look,
Last crop is blacktop.
some of these things might have to. I think honestly, thinking about how to build smartly with respect to both education, access to transportation, et cetera, that's all really important. I don't think we've seen, I'm from California, I don't think we've seen any state do this well, certainly not in California. It'd be really interesting to see if New Jersey could be a leader in that.
I just stepped down from the planning board in my city because it is rough. It's just, there are a lot of, you can imagine every argument in the world for why people don't want to build more housing. It's terrible.
Home rule is the only rule in New Jersey, but we got to figure it out. Right. Thank you all for being generous with your time and your expertise today. I very much so appreciate it. Yes, thank you all. Okay. So we'll do Q&A. I don't know if Stacy or Thelma, would you mind if folks or CC, folks have questions? Okay, you have a microphone already. Great, perfect.
Hi, thank you so much for coming and speaking. It was really great. I guess I kind of wanted to ask a bit of a broader question. So if you have vague answers, that's totally okay. But economic development can be very kind of outwardly focused, which in some ways is maybe like a natural part of the process, right? We're thinking of how to solve problems from a place like Princeton, a very like heavily resourced sort of core, solving problems outwards towards a periphery or a margin. And I think, I don't know, as a young person, I feel that if we want a new generation of development or of progress, we kind of need to solve problems in new ways with new knowledge. So my question for you guys was, how can we learn from the periphery instead of just from the core? And what would be kind of a non-traditional source of knowledge that you guys are personally excited to see tapped in kind of the coming new generation of economic development? Thank you.
We've only met once, but this is what we talked about, in a way.
Yeah. I think that it's tough, but because I want to say, I think that this has already been done. There is so much that has been built in communities for so long. When I think about like the criminal legal system, I think about Ruth Wilson Gilmore and Angela Davis, right? These folks were talking about the kind of policies that we only have just started working on. And they've been building that movement for decades before we came along. And so I guess that is kind of an answer about non-traditional sources of knowledge, but I don't think it's new. Yeah.
I'll just add to that. I totally agree with that. I really think we need to build better bridges. Yeah. Like, we have islands, like lots of islands. Like, there's some like federal policy expert islands. There's some, there are some governmental islands there, and there are certainly sources of knowledge, lots of different places that are not quote unquote central and not well resourced. In fact, there are often better answers. There are almost certainly better answers to some questions there because people actually live with the problems that they're trying to solve. They're trying to solve them not out of some intellectual or, oh yeah, this is my job, so I need the right spreadsheet, but they're actually trying to answer those questions, those problems, because they are their problems.
Yeah.
And we have terrible bridges. We might even have like anti-bridges, but we don't do enough to actually build good networks of people who are. There are no good networks, there are no good on-ramps for people who are trying to solve a problem over here, to bring them into and to bring them into a center of power and to contest for power, to contest for a seat at the decision-making table, maybe even the head of the decision-making table. So I would say what we need is more bridges, more on-ramps, more bridges.
Yeah, and I just want to add to that. So in the policy work that I do, we have a few things that we say. We say lived experience is expertise. And we also say those that are closest to the problem are closest to the solution. I'm sure you've probably heard that before. And it is so true because you watch it play out practically time and time again, where legislators and all these folks will get in a room and they'll come up with this policy that they're trying to solve this problem. And somebody that has been living with this problem their entire life walks in and says, if you do that, X, Y, and Z will happen. And it's something they just hadn't even thought of. And so yeah, 100%.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of opportunities to learn from people who are on the front lines of experiencing policies. Often that means sort of bottom up, but in a socioeconomic sense when we're thinking about a lot of social policies. But I think it's broader than that. I've been doing work on administrative burdens as sort of a mechanism of inequality. It's amazing how talking to just anyone who's interacting with a policy can provide often surprisingly simple fixes to things that were just unintended consequences of a sort of administrative implementation. A lot of that's frankly not very revolutionary, but it is ways, it's
life-changing.
Yes, and it can be, and it's often not as politically costly as some other kinds of things.
But let me also say, sitting here at Princeton University, that I'm actually also pro-expertise. I think it really matters that Marlena has spent 15 years or 20 years or however many years learning the criminal justice system, that Adam has deeply invested in understanding the mechanisms of how debt works, student debt, all the rest of your research. It actually really matters. So it's not an either or, but people who lived experience, coming from a place where the problem is extremely pervasive, living in that, that is a kind of expertise. And people like that, my own parents, my own grandparents, we need expertise because expertise will help us solve those problems better. So it's bridges, it's not a wholesale pivot.
I'll just relay two stories, really quick, one that I heard and one that I can share. Dorothy Brown wrote a book called The Whiteness of Wealth that, I guess, 3 or 4 years old at this point, exploring the tax code and how it treats different tax filers differently. But in the introduction to that book, she talks about how when she was talking to other tax experts about the questions she had about was there discrimination in the tax code, they were all sort of saying, this is a silly question to ask. Of course there's not, right? It treats people as they are. She had to go outside of her bubble and talk to sociologists who were like, of course there is. Yes, this is a great question to ask, right? And so to the point about building bridges and talking to other folks, don't stay in your bubble, right? Princeton's 20 miles from Trenton's, don't stay in your bubble. And a personal story I can share is, so I was connected with some folks at Rutgers that are doing research on how to better provide care to folks with sickle cell anemia. I have sickle cell anemia. And so I was in this conversation with a bunch of healthcare policy experts, doctors, emergency room doctors, and they were asking all these sort of basic questions, and I was just sharing my experience about access to care, discrimination in care. I'm a very well-informed patient, and they were treating it like I was telling them the code to the universe. They're like, oh my God, I never thought about these things. And so you gotta talk to them. It's closest to the problem, closest to the solution. Talk to people who are experiencing the issue that you're interested in, for sure.
Thank you for answering.
Any other questions?
Can I just add one more piece to that I think didn't come up? Is even among experts, there's a shocking degree of fragmentation. We sometimes call this policy siloing, right? I'm
Actually, how you get tenure. To be the best at your little tiny silo. It's not that I meant one.
It's also how you rise to the head
tenure.
of a legislative committee or something. I mean, it's
Right.
academic.
It's the coin of the realm. Yeah. I'm the best at my one thing.
Yeah. And so thinking about, a lot of these really, so-called wicked problems are obviously interlinked across different domains, and trying to learn from, if you're interested in economic development, well, you should probably also be thinking about environmental policy, right? You should also be thinking about housing policy. So, I think it's an easy thing to say. It's harder to implement, but that's another dimension on which to think about that.
Thank you very much. Adam, you mentioned in one of your opening comments that you felt like there were actual common threads between the progressive movement today and some of the voices on the conservative side. I wonder if you could maybe expound upon that. And then follow-up question, and I would love to maybe hear that same question or the answer from both of you, or all three of you. And then just curious to know, what's the barrier from why these threads are not converging together, and what would it take, particularly in this political environment, for those threads to merge together?
Yeah, I don't want to overstate that. I think there has certainly been a wide range, and for different reasons on different sides, turn away from what we might call sort of a 1990s era consensus when it comes to international trade policy. And I think that's where you see it most clearly. The Republicans have been, reluctantly and quietly on board with some elements of the industrial policy as well, although they're a little inconsistent on that matter. So I think that there are, I'd say rather more parallel than convergent, at least in some of these domains. Obviously, it's not hard to find areas of divergence as well on a whole host of policy issues. But I think that's one where we see sort of the so-called neoliberal era kind of disappearing from multiple sides.
I totally agree with that. I think, to get really specific about trade policy, right? Trade policy used to literally be about globalization for its own sake, right? Global growth, the growth of multinational corporations, global capital, the lowering of trade barriers, that was supposed to bring goodness for all. It actually, you can argue that in some ways, absolute poverty in some countries actually lessened during that era. That is true. But what you also saw in that era was the hollowing out of enormous, but this is obviously the set of problems around the NAFTA policy, the NAFTA treaty from the 1990s, from the Clinton era. You saw the absolute hollowing out of entire swaths of the country. So, cities and towns in Appalachia, in Michigan, in Ohio, in probably parts of this state, certainly parts of Pennsylvania. I don't know enough about New Jersey, South. Okay, this is all the result of actually trade policy. So the reversal in trade policy now is to say, wait. Maybe we should be consuming purposefully and prioritizing trade. This is what progressives would say, prioritizing trade that comes along with. We should be making it easier to trade policies that are products, that are cleaner, and easier to trade products that are made by high-wage labor in the United States and in other countries. So, that's a shift from globalization for its own sake. I think the reason that you see overlap with some people on the right is actually exemplified by J.D. Vance. J.D. Vance literally comes from a town in Ohio that was decimated by NAFTA. He understands that. It is part of his politics. If that's where it stopped, I think some of my colleagues at the Roosevelt Institute and J.D. Vance would certainly agree, at least on the diagnosis of the problem, and maybe even on some narrow solutions. There are a whole bunch of reasons, even in trade policy, that we might not agree beyond that. But one of the reasons you see overlap is because human beings do sometimes see common problems that affect people regardless of, their blueness or their redness. However, I would say that J.D. Vance also exemplifies the reason. I know this is a 501c3 conversation, but some of the other choices that people have made, well, actually, I don't think I can actually say this in a 501c3 conversation, so, or am I allowed to?
Well, I know a way to say it.
Okay, go ahead, you say
All
it.
right.
I think it's probably obvious, but we should make the implicit explicit. Go ahead, say it.
I think what prevents convergence is that on any policy question you ever come across, you should always add at the end of it, for who. Right? And I think that is what is preventing convergence. There is a disagreement on for who, and which communities should either be the priority or should benefit wholly and completely. And there's a lot, that is the bifurcation and sort of the segregation that exists, is just disagreement on who needs to be the focus of these efforts. Is that what you're going to say?
That's a good answer.
Okay.
That's not what I was going to say, but I stopped saying because I literally can't. I mean, I don't think I can in a nonprofit
You can say
conversation.
it afterwards.
But I do think there are really interesting areas of convergence, not only on tax policy. You will see some conservatives now arguing that wages need to be higher. There's a better example. Wages need to be higher. Why do wages need to be higher? I think wages need to be higher so that anyone can earn make sure that they can only have to work one job and still be able to serve, their families themselves, provide for their families and themselves. Conservatives often will say that they want wages to be higher so that in a two-parent family, only one parent has to work. It is often explicitly the woman in a traditional marriage arrangement who should stay home. This is literally a vision of the common good. This is not a partisan statement. So wages need to be higher for one person, usually the man, so that one person, usually the woman, can stay home to take care of kids. That's a normative statement that they will make, and so we can agree on higher wages, but we may not agree on why. So that's just another example of, we so much agree on that, we might not agree on this other thing. Now what do we do about it? So I think this is a very interesting. I'm not trying to be snide about it. This is a very interesting and somewhat complicated conversation. It would be made easier if we weren't in the current electoral environment. If we were talking purely policy, it would be easier to have these conversations about convergence. Unfortunately, we're never talking purely policy.
On Brandon's point about for whom, I think I understand the tenor of that. I think there are actually interesting sort of strategic questions in the development of policies in the Biden administration about for whom. A lot of economic investment has been, I think, purposely directed into what we might call more red-leaning states. That reflected a very particular theory of change. It's one that a theory of change in which sort of it was modeled in some ways on the 1930s vision, right? That by investing in places it would be possible to that had turned away from progressive politics, that it'd be possible to build new coalitions. It's a good theory of change, but there's a temporal lag issue that I think we're all contending with right now. But I think the for whom thing is actually part of the strategy.
Done? Oh, there's one. Okay, we have one more question, and then we'll wrap. Thank you.
I think it's pretty quick. I was just in thinking about this huge communications problem that y'all were touching on before, and the way that people understand the economy as a personal political issue and kind of like seeing prices rise. And then also being unapologetic about tackling inequality. At the end of next year, when the TCJA expires, how do we talk about reforming the tax code in a way that, combats the narrative that raising taxes on corporations and wealthy people will scare them away from the U.S. and ultimately, I feel like all the traditional narratives that you encounter, I'm wondering if y'all have simple ways to combat them and just kind of like understand the bigger picture. And I know that that's really hard because we've just been talking about how hard it is to talk about these things, but.
I have thoughts. Okay. So I think in general, the Center on Budget, and a gentleman named Mike Mazarov, who recently retired but is still active because he can't help himself, thankfully, has done a ton of research on what is the sort of behavior of the very wealthy to changes in the tax code. And pre-TCJA, Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which is the Trump tax plan, did a lot of research showing that the very wealthy actually, they don't move a lot based on changes in the tax code because they're prioritizing quality of life. They're prioritizing access to markets, access to things that they want to do on a day-to-day basis, culture, quality of education, things like that. And so there was a lot of sort of brouhaha around, well, does this still apply after the implementation of the TCJA? And earlier this year, he released a new paper saying, yep, still applies, right? Like this is just, we're still seeing the same behavior. And so I think, to me, the thing to, I think, emphasize is, what are the qualities of a good life? What are the things that we want everybody to be able to experience regardless of where they are? Of course, location matters. Of course, not every location is going to have every resource, to the extent that it may need it in full. But can we at least agree on what are the qualities of a good life that folks need to be able to take care of themselves and their family and their community? And what is then can we say, okay, what is the tax treatment or the tax design that will allow for that? But I think because of the way that sort of tax and budget processes in states especially are set up, they thrive on lack of information to the public. They thrive on lack of access for the public to government committee hearings and whatnot. Like, how many of you even know when the budget is getting heard in Trenton? Lots of times the budget is passed after a vote that only took 10 minutes. 99% of the lawmakers that did not read the budget, they did not read all 250 pages of the budget and then how all $60 billion is going to be spent, right? And so even just the structures of how do we pass policy at the state level sort of prevents, I think, the ability to have a more robust, honest, and authentic and inclusive conversation about what we want tax policy to mean for our economy and our lives. And so we kind of, it's an unsexy thing, but we got to kind of tackle process. The process allows for the sort of pushing out of public engagement and shutting down of public consideration in really pernicious ways. But if we tackle process and allow for more engagement and more inclusion, it's not going to be perfect. It's going to be ugly. It's going to be hard. But at the end of the day, what is all this for? If not for trying to improve the quality of our communities and the quality of the lives that people are leading. And I, as someone who went to the Blaustein School at Rutgers and got a degree in urban planning and expected to lead a life figuring out how to build housing, when I realized that the amount of housing I could build was constricted by the budget, that's what got me into budget policy. And I think the conversation on tax and budget policy in America is incredibly immature. It is not about these things, right? There's a saying in tax policy circles these days: talk about the brownie, not the recipe. The recipe is the tax policy. The brownie is good schools, healthy communities, right? Safe drinking water. Let's talk about that stuff.
I just want to add a little bit to that because I don't feel like we do it enough. You hear all these stories or narratives about New Jersey being this high tax state, but you don't hear about all of the beautiful things. We don't celebrate enough the things that our taxes get us and why so many people want to live here. And I think to what you're saying, if we could be more transparent, if we could say, look, this money got you this, I think that would help buy-in.
Okay. Thank you all very much for being here this evening.